Welcome, everyone. We're starting a little early today because we've got a great speaker who's got a lot of stuff to say about Abraham Lincoln. So if everyone could stand and join me in the defining statement. Kiwanis is a global organization of volunteers dedicated to improving the world one child and one community at a time. We'll say our pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Scott Pius has our prayer today.
I got an email from Sanders says, would you help me with the prayer? I said at first, and then I said, why you tell a lady no? And I've never prayed from a podium. I've been accused of being a preacher a few times, but never done prayer. I had to do a little looking at myself when I said I'm going to stand up and pray with you people, us, a little introspective thinking. I fell back on Thomas Keating. I don't know if any of you have run across him. He died in 2018 at the age of 95. He was born into a wealthy family on the East Coast, attended prep schools, private ones, went on to get a number of degrees at Yale and Fordham, but he chose a life as a Trappist priest or monk. And as one of the principal developers of centering prayer, or what is known as contemplative prayer. And one of the things he's known to have said is, silence is God's first language. Everything else is a poor translation. Silence is God's first language. Everything else is a poor translation. We're all old enough to have had experience with frustration, be it relationships, employment, children, where we thought we could be helpful. And, I have found myself repeatedly saying the serenity for prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking as Jesus did the sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Serenity, courage, wisdom. Amen.
Thank you, Scott. You did a great job. Do we have guests I know we have guests with us today because I've already met several of them. Buck?
Good afternoon to everyone. I have as my guest today, Hall, if you'll please stand up for his third visit with us. Hall Edwards, and I just happen to have his membership application and his check in my hand. So he is a funeral director with Brown Wind Funeral Home, a graduate of NC State. He loves to fish and hunt. We're just glad to have him as a Kiwanian now. Thank you so much.
I have a guest with us today. I've got my mother, Lucy Grice. If you met her at the baseball game, she's here with us today. And I just want to say hello from the back here.
It is Tarver's guest, but he wanted me to introduce her. This is Debbie. She has the great distinction of being Tarver's neighbor, and she's a retired nurse. And that's all I know about her.
Thanks for coming, Debbie.
With me today is my great friend, Benbury Wood. He and I attended prep school together back in the 70s, early 80s. He drove all the way up here from Eden. Please welcome him.
Introduce this member who's going to introduce a guest. This is Jefferson Griffin.
Thank you. I don't always get that that reaction. So today, Chris Dillon, everybody knows Chris. This is Chris's at least third visit. He is eligible to join. We just got to get an application in his hand. Right, Chris? Yeah. But Chris he serves on the Court of Appeals with me. His dad was a member of our club. Also, Jason Tyson. Jason went to UNCW, grew up in Fayetteville, grad school at Wake Forest. He is the communications director for the Department of Insurance here in North Carolina. And your dad's a member in the Fayetteville Club, right? His dad's a member of the Fayetteville Kiwanis Club, so he's got some prior relationship with our organization. So welcome, both of them.
Thank you.
For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bill Watson. I'm an infrequent visitor here in Raleigh, but a longtime member. I have today as my guest my wife, Laura Cooper.
Anybody else? This is fantastic to have so many members here and to have so many guests. Membership welfare, I'm just going to do this from the podium, but please join in if anybody has any word. Jill Bryan's father died. When was that, Buck? Just last night. So keep her in your thoughts and prayers. Is there any other membership welfare items? Okay. We have a few announcements. Past President's Luncheon was yesterday. Thank you so much. Elle's not here today, but thanks to Elle for organizing it. Thanks to Hugh for being there to record it. And thanks to Eric Atkinson for taking photos. It was a really, really nice event. Mill Burning Night, October 20th. Phil Kirk told me yesterday that the thing he is the most disappointed about my term as president is I was not able to make sure there was oyster casserole last year at Mill Burning Night. Stacy she's as always on the ball, and it's happening this year. So oyster casserole's back. October 20th, there are sign-up sheets on everybody's table, so please come. If you've never attended, it's a really fun event. Pancake Breakfast, October 22nd. Your tickets are back in the back with Rocky and Cricket. We still need sponsors and raffle items, so please let us know if you have any of that available to you. And finally, the Kiwanis Foundation is happy to announce nominees for their board today. Gwen Bass, can you stand? I know Gwen's here. There's Gwen, Rocky Strickland, and Phil Kirk. I don't think Phil's with us today. So we'll be voting on those 3 board positions on October 7th. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Lee Parker, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Sandra. Over the course of our lives, especially when we were in school, we've all had individuals that stick out as exceptional relationships, mentors, and influencers. Today, I have the honor of introducing to you that very person in my life. In 1977, as a student at Virginia Episcopal School, Billy Peebles was my AP American history teacher. He made such impression on me that that was the reason that I decided to major in history at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Billy has been dedicated to education and teaching for over 35 years at the Lovett School in Atlanta, and now serving as headmaster at Collegiate School in Richmond, Virginia, of where he is driven by to see us today. Y'all please welcome Billy Peebles.
Thank you, Lee. Mighty kind introduction. It's great having 2 of my former students here with me today. Lee, who's gracious enough to invite me, and Benbury Wood down there sitting across from him, and appreciate you folks having me today. It's a privilege to talk a little bit about Abraham Lincoln, a real hero. There's so much to say about Lincoln. Supposedly, if you Google Lincoln, you'll find that there's only one person about whom more has been written, and that's Jesus Christ. But I particularly want to talk about Lincoln's qualities as a writer and speaker, and I'm interested in that because as a teacher of history and government and religion for 40 years now, I worry that we do not give language the care and respect it deserves. Lincoln cared deeply about language. In many ways, he revered language. Keep in mind, folks, that Lincoln had very little formal education. He spent as much time in a formal school setting as any of us in this room spent in kindergarten. And after that, he was really self-taught. Most historians consider him as our best writer among our presidents, perhaps rivaled only by Thomas Jefferson. And of course, Jefferson, by the standards of his day, had the best education money could buy. He had tutors. He attended William and Mary, the third oldest college in the country. He had very learned people at his disposal as his tutors and his mentors, and yet Lincoln is still deemed our best writer. And so I want to try and briefly capture this afternoon why his written and spoken language were so effective and so revered by historians. I want to focus my remarks on two of Lincoln's works: his February 27th, 1860 speech at Cooper Union in New York, a speech that he and many of his contemporaries and many historians believed helped propel him to the presidency. I want to talk a little bit about Cooper Union, and then his July 4th, 1861 message to a special session of Congress, which he called to support a war that had already begun, the Civil War. These two pieces are representative of Lincoln's use of the written and spoken word as enormously effective tools of political persuasion. As we look at these two works, let me suggest one lens through which we might judge our 16th president's rhetoric, and that would be a treatise by the great philosopher Aristotle. The treatise was called A Treatise on Rhetoric. Aristotle believed that there are three ways in which a speaker or writer persuades his audience. The first way, and for Aristotle the most important way, is through ethos, or the credibility of the speaker's character. For Aristotle, personal character and the spoken word were inseparable. The second way to persuade is through logos, or the logic of the arguments which the speaker or writer demonstrates. And the third way is pathos, or the ability to understand the thoughts, concerns, and feelings of the audience, and thus to connect with and to speak to one's listeners' hearts and souls. There's no evidence that Lincoln read Aristotle, though we know he read works on rhetoric, and these works were informed by Aristotle's teaching. We also know that he taught himself, think about this, folks, Euclidean geometry. Lincoln did. He studied English grammar meticulously. His mastery of geometric proofs, grammar, and the law, coupled with his reverence for clarity and reason and rationality, and his great political instincts and intuition about people and public opinion, helped fuel his skill for effective and convincing rhetoric. Plus, he was just curious about clarity. If he were a part of a conversation that he didn't understand, and this goes back to when he was a young boy, he would literally stay awake at night trying to replay the conversation in his head so that he could understand it. Clarity and understanding were really important to him. Lincoln at Cooper Union, February 27th, 1860. Lincoln's strong performance against Stephen Douglas in the Illinois Senate race of 1858 drew the attention of Eastern Republicans, many of whom were seeking an alternative to William Seward, the leading candidate for the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1860. While these Easterners were by no means convinced that a country lawyer from Illinois should be their standard bearer, they were impressed with much of what he had to say in the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, and with the fact that he almost won that senatorial election against a much more established and popular politician in Stephen Douglas, who was the leading Democrat of that day. In fact, Lincoln received more popular votes than Douglas in that contest, but Democrats had the advantage in the Illinois state legislature, which, as was the case with all state legislatures of the time, was empowered to select the Illinois senator, so Douglas won. In mid-October 1859, Lincoln was invited to speak at Henry Ward Beecher's famous Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, New York. Because of Beecher's fame, and also because the trip east would give Lincoln the chance to visit his son Robert, who was preparing for Harvard by spending a postgraduate year at Phillips Exeter, Lincoln immediately accepted the invitation with the understanding that he would make a political speech. And of course, Lincoln was excited about the additional exposure this setting would give him. Shortly before he was to leave for Brooklyn, the location for Lincoln's speech was changed to the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Arts located in Manhattan. From a political perspective, this new location was even better for Lincoln because leading Republicans and journalists would more likely attend. As it turned out, New York Evening Post editor and noted poet William Cullen Bryant introduced Lincoln at Cooper Union, and leading journalists like Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, which was the publication that had the greatest readership in that era, but people like Greeley were going to be present as well. Lincoln prepared meticulously for this speech. His law partner, William Herndon, said that Lincoln gave more time and energy to this speech than to any other. And that's saying a lot, folks, because in 1854, his first big speech of any kind of national renown, and I'm not exaggerating, was 30,000 words long, took him 3.5 hours to deliver, and people would actually listen that long. They had a little bit better attention span than we do today. Lincoln was painstaking and thorough in the study of his subject in preparation for Cooper Union. He spent hours at the Illinois State Library reading and rereading Eliot's Debates on the Federal Constitution, James Kent's Commentaries on the Constitution, and examining the annals of Congress and the Congressional Globe, and poring over old war newspapers. He read Jefferson's autobiography, the letters of George Washington, and the papers of James Madison. Keep in mind that Lincoln always did his own research and writing, but he had never prepared as carefully for a speech as he did for his Cooper Union address. As he began his address on a snowy Monday evening in Manhattan, Lincoln's appearance, he had a very awkward appearance, his obvious nervousness, his discomfort in his new suit that he bought specifically for this engagement, his high-pitched voice. Old television movies about Lincoln would have you believe that he had a deep voice. He actually had a really high-pitched tenor voice, but it carried. But his high-pitched tenor voice and Western drawl did not initially inspire the confidence of his audience at Cooper Union. There were many in the audience who, based on this first impression, perceived Lincoln as something weird, rough, and uncultivated, and as gawky and clumsy. Some in the audience wondered how this giraffe from the prairies had ever given 5 minutes trouble to Stephen Douglas. Before Lincoln spoke, one observer remarked skeptically toward Lincoln and within earshot of the journalist Noah Brooks, quote, "Old fella, you won't do it. It's all very well for the Wild West, but this will never go down here in New York City." But Lincoln often started his speeches dryly and slowly. After he got past his opening remarks, he began to gain momentum, and his listeners became more and more engaged. The first half of this 1.5-hour address, which totaled some 7,700 words, took the form of a legal brief in which he persuasively challenged Stephen Douglas's often expressed argument that the Founding Fathers did not make a moral judgment against slavery and its growth, and that indeed the Founding Fathers would have supported Douglas's popular sovereignty doctrine. As one historian has said, Lincoln pulled out all the legal stops for this elite group of New Yorkers and marshaled text after text, citation after citation, from Washington to Madison to show that nothing or no one before Roger Brooke Taney, author of the 1857 Dred Scott decision, and Stephen Douglas ever questioned the authority of the federal government to control slavery in the federal territories. Lincoln talked at length about the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and other legislative acts endorsed by the Founding Fathers to prove that at least 21 of the 39 original signers of the federal Constitution in 1787 actually were right at the anniversary, September 1787, but 21 of the 39 original signers at one time or another had voted to limit slavery and to put it on the road to ultimate extinction. Lincoln then directed some remarks to the South and to the members of his own party, and they were numerous who were not in favor of the immediate abolition of slavery. He made clear his strong belief that the federal government did not have the authority to tamper with slavery where it already existed, but it did have the authority to contain its growth and ultimately to see it end. John Brown's raids on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry of just 4 months earlier, October 1859, that was also very much on people's minds. John Brown had hoped his raid would spark a slave insurrection that would spread throughout the South, but his attack was quickly put down by federal military troops led by then U.S. Army Colonel Robert E. Lee. Brown had been hanged at Harper's Ferry on December 2nd, 1859 for this raid. Many Southerners believed that Brown's raid had the tacit, if not explicit, support of many Republicans, and in fact, a number of prominent Northerners, people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, praised John Brown as a hero and a saint. But Lincoln reminded Southerners in his address at Cooper Union of the key facts regarding John Brown. First, Brown was no Republican, and not a single member of the Republican Party had been implicated in his failed venture. On the heels of John Brown's raid, and as the Republican Party gained more and more strength in northern and northwestern states, increasing numbers of Southerners were threatening secession if a Republican won the presidency in 1860, and Lincoln felt that he had to deal head-on with these threats. And here's what he said, quote, "But you of the South will not abide the election of a Republican president? In that supposed event, you say you will destroy the Union, and then you say the great crime of having destroyed it will be upon us. That is cool," he said. Those were his words. That's cool. "A highwayman," he says, "holds a pistol to my ear and mutters through his teeth, 'Stand and deliver, or I shall kill you, and then you will be a murderer.' To be sure," Lincoln continues, "what the robber demanded of me, my money, was my own, and I had a clear right to keep it, but it was no more my own than my vote is my own, and the threat of death to me to extort my money and the threat of destruction of the Union to extort my vote can scarcely be distinguished in principle," close quote. Lincoln concluded his speech at Cooper Union with an inspiring summoning to his fellow Republicans for courage and conviction. "We cannot succumb," he admonished, "to fancy-sounding but hollow arguments which get thrown at us regularly by the disunionists. Arguments such as those encouraging us to find some middle ground between the right and the wrong. Vain is the search for a man who should be neither a living man nor a dead man, such as a policy of don't care on a question about which all true men do care, such as union appeals beseeching true union men to yield to disunionists, reversing the divine rule and calling not the sinners, but the righteous to repentance, such as invocations to Washington imploring men to unsay what Washington said and undo what Washington did," close quote. Washington and Jefferson were two true heroes to Lincoln. And then Lincoln closed at Cooper Union with these two very memorable sentences, quote, "Neither let us be slandered from our duty by false accusations against us, nor frightened from it by menaces of destruction to the government, nor of dungeons to ourselves. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it," close quote. As Lincoln ended his speech, his listeners were so still that they could hear the quiet sizzling of the gas burners. There were about 1,500 people there at Cooper Union. And then suddenly, all in the audience stood, applauded, and cheered loudly. One observer said this, quote, "As the speech progressed, the speaker seemed to get control of himself. He caught the tone of the hall. He had never spoken in this large a setting. And his voice gained a natural and impressive modulation. The gestures were dignified and appropriate, and the hearers came under the influence of the earnest look from the deeply set eyes and of the absolute integrity of purpose and devotion to principle, which were behind the thoughts and words of the speaker," close quote. Another observer said this, "When Lincoln spoke, he was transformed. His eye kindled, his voice rang, his face shone and seemed to light up the whole assembly. For an hour and a half, he held his audience in the palm of his hand. His style of speech and manner of delivery were severely simple. He found his way to the grandeur and strength of absolute simplicity," close quote. Lincoln had clearly been a hit with his New York audience. Later that same evening, following dinner with some of his hosts, Lincoln walked to the office of the New York Tribune. Again, that's Horace Greeley's newspaper, the largest readership of any paper in the country. But he goes to the New York Tribune office to review the printed copy of his speech. He wanted to be sure that the newspaper version of this speech was accurate before it hit the streets. The next morning, 4 newspapers printed 170,000 copies of his Cooper Union address in full. In hindsight, his speech at Cooper Union was his launching pad for the presidency as well as his campaign platform. Between the time of this notable address, February 27, 1860, and his receiving the Republican nomination in May 1860, 3 months later, and then winning the presidency 6 months later, November 1860, he stuck unrelentingly to the position he outlined in the Cooper Union speech and quoted almost verbatim from it on those occasions in which he was called on to articulate his positions on secession, whether the federal government had authority over the spread of slavery and the history of our republic in the context of slavery. In the 11 days after Cooper Union, Lincoln delivered 11 more speeches in 3 New England states, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. This tour took him to 3 state capitals and 2 university towns. In each of these stops, he spoke between 1,000 and 1,500 people. He spoke on March 3rd in Exeter, New Hampshire, where his son Robert was preparing for Harvard. Comments from the audience at the start of this talk were similar to those made as Lincoln took the stage at Cooper Union. According to Harold Holzer, who I think is the most informed historian about Cooper Union, quote, when Lincoln finally entered the hall from the rear, one of his son's school friends from Exeter, a fellow named Robert Atkins, took one look at the guest of honor and thought, quote, what a darn fool I've been to walk up here through the mud to hear that man speak. Within 10 minutes, he remembered, I was glad I was there. Lincoln always took a few minutes to warm to his listeners, and they to him. The political results ensuing from the Cooper Union address speak for themselves. In the 4 states in which Lincoln appeared in his tour east, New York, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Connecticut, he received 55% of the popular vote in the election of 1860 and won 50 electoral votes. This region was critical to his receiving the nomination and his being elected president. Again, back to Harold Holzer, who's written most thoughtfully, I think, about this speech. He had this to say about Cooper Union. Lincoln's address was no customary, crowd-pleasing, anti-slavery speech. In fact, Holzer offers that the medium through which Lincoln communicated, a political lecture of 7,715 words, was very risky. Rather than a barn burner kind of speech, Lincoln, in a way true to him and his character and soul, offered a laboriously researched, studiously legalistic, and dispassionately restrained anti-slavery treatise that harkened back to the will of the founding fathers, preached political moderation and sectional harmony, yet at the same time bristled with barely contained indignation over the moral outrage of human slavery, close quote. Aristotle himself could never have wished for a more successful effort by Lincoln to establish his credibility, to make his case logically and persuasively, and to knit himself to the people whose support he had to have for political success. Lincoln's message to Congress in special session, July 4th, 1861. No American president faced more daunting challenges in the early months in office than did Abraham Lincoln. He had no political honeymoon whatsoever. 7 states had seceded from the Union between the time he was elected in November and the time he took office, March 4th, 1861, and 4 more southern states would soon secede. Early on March 5th, folks, his second day as president, he was notified that the War Department had received the previous day, the day of his inauguration, a letter from the commander at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, stating that he and his men had only 6 months of supplies remaining, and then unless he was resupplied, he would have no choice but to surrender this federal fort, one of the few federal forts remaining. Immediately upon assuming office, he was criticized. Lincoln was criticized for his rough and unkempt appearance, his lack of administrative experience, and his lack of formal education. The only thing Lincoln had run before he became president was a 2-person law office. Lincoln even admitted to one of his Illinois political allies that when he first commenced to doing the duties, he was entirely ignorant, not only of the duties, but of the manner of doing the business of the presidency. Lincoln's two secretaries, his staff leaders, John Hay and John Nicolay, along with other political allies, found Lincoln's administrative style to be haphazard, frustrating, disorganized. The president did streamline his style over time, but he consistently made himself enormously accessible to visitors so as to help him understand what was on the minds of his fellow citizens and also to give him further opportunity to shape public opinion. He called these his public opinion baths. On April 1st, less than a month into his presidency, Lincoln's chief rival for the Republican presidential nomination and now the most influential member of his cabinet, Secretary of State William Seward, wrote Lincoln complaining about the lack of direction in Lincoln's domestic and foreign policy and suggested that perhaps he, Seward, should be tasked to give direction to the administration. And while Lincoln responded to Seward the same day with a strong and clear reminder that he, not Seward, was the president, and pretty quickly won Seward's trust and support and friendship, it must have been enormously disconcerting to have his most senior advisor challenge his authority and competence less than 30 days into his presidency. 2 days after Seward's letter, staunch Republican Henry Raymond, founder and editor of the New York Times, prints an editorial entitled, quote, "Wanted, a Policy," close quote, in which he accuses the new Republican administration of a blindness and ineptitude without parallel in the history of intelligent statesmanship. While taking stock of the criticisms of Seward and Raymond, two supposed political allies, be wary of our friends, right? The debate continues to rage over Fort Sumter. Folks, as an aside, how many of you read Doris Kearns Goodwin, Team of Rivals? One of the finest books I've ever seen about Lincoln and about leadership, where he brings into his cabinet his three chief rivals for the Republican nomination in 1860, Salmon Chase, Edward Bates, William Seward, and then brings in Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, who was just cruel and rude to him when they tried a monopoly case together out in, I think that was in Cincinnati. Virtually all of Lincoln's chief advisors are in favor of evacuating Fort Sumter. Lincoln cannot accept this position. In his mind, to evacuate the fort might damage Union morale irreparably and give credence to the idea of secession. He decides to resupply Fort Sumter with non-military supplies and made clear his intention to do so to the country and to the governor of North Carolina. It's a brilliant strategy, folks, because then it puts the South in the position of starting the war. And so Beauregard, shortly after that, launches the attack on Fort Sumter. After that attack on the Union garrison, that's April 12th, 1861, the president, under the executive's war powers and with Congress not being in formal session, took a number of decisive actions. He calls up 75,000 volunteers, and that's quickly increased to 400,000 volunteers for the war effort. He works out a creative, and I know we got some lawyers and judges in here, he works out a creative, if not extra legal and perhaps illegal way to finance the early days of the war. He suspends habeas corpus along the route between Washington and Baltimore, and he establishes the blockade of southern ports. He's also presiding over hundreds of patronage claims that he insisted on overseeing. Simultaneously, a number of talented military officers like Lee were resigning their commissions and heading to leadership positions in the Confederate armies. The combination of all these facts made the Lincoln White House a center of chaos and confusion. Lincoln later told his friend, Illinois Senator Orville Browning, that his troubles of the first several months were so great that could I have anticipated them, I would not have believed it possible to survive them. But he does. Amidst all of these challenges, Lincoln somehow musters the discipline to devote time and thought to constructing his message to be made to a special session of Congress, which was to open July 4th, 1861, and of course there's huge symbolism to his picking that date. When it became known that Lincoln was insisting on writing this message himself, many saw this as just another example of how an inexperienced executive is wasting his time doing what might be better delegated. Among his critics was Ralph Waldo Emerson, who complained that rather than writing his own message, Lincoln should draw on the deeper understanding of the war already available and not waste his own time constructing the address. But Lincoln saw the task of building this message himself not as something that could be delegated, either in whole or in part, but rather as a prime presidential opportunity to define the issues and to explain the meaning of the war to his country and why this war had to be fought. And by the way, as had been the case in the Cooper Union speech, with this July 4th message, and indeed with all of his speeches, as best we can tell, Lincoln employed no researchers, nobody to check references, and no speech writers to compose drafts. Lincoln wrote all of his speeches himself, pen to paper, word by word. Lincoln did test his ideas with others and shared his drafts for comment. He had done the same when he gave his first inaugural, March 4th, 1861. He took some advice, a lot of advice from Seward, but the ultimate result was Lincoln's own language, On May 7th, almost 2 months before Congress would meet in special session on July 4th, the president began to test some of the ideas he had for his message. In a conversation with his secretaries Hay and Nicolay, Lincoln remarked that the real question involved in this tumultuous situation was whether a free and representative government had the right to protect and maintain itself. John Hay quoted the president as saying, quote, "I consider the central idea pervading this struggle is the necessity that is upon us of proving that popular government is not an absurdity." In terms of personal relationships, Lincoln was very private. He was shut-mouthed, as his law partner William Herndon described him, but he loved intellectual exchange, and liked to try out his ideas, to hear honest reactions to his ideas, to read out his ideas and his prose out loud for others to hear. In general, Lincoln liked to read aloud what he had written because, as he told Herndon, "I catch the idea by two senses, for when I read aloud, I hear what is read, and I see it, and I remember it better if I do not understand it better." Lincoln said elsewhere that I write by ear. One historian of Lincoln's language says Lincoln's basic sense of language, like the poets, is oral. He hears it. Lincoln was guided by sound, the sounds of the living sentence. By reading his words aloud, Lincoln was trying further to put himself in the shoes of his listeners and develop that pathos, that empathy so important to effective communication. In mid-June, the president cut back on his appointments and gave almost his full attention to the writing of the message. Nicolay wrote his fiancée that since my return from Illinois on June 18th, the president has been engaged almost constantly in writing his message and has refused to receive any calls whatsoever, either of friendship or business, except from members of cabinet or other high government officials. John Hay confirmed that Lincoln has been engaged in constant thought upon his message. It will be an exhaustive review of the questions of the hour and of the future. Lincoln had decided that given the fact that the very survival of the Union was at stake, the most important use of his time was to work at communicating with his fellow countrymen in the most effective way possible the reasons for the war, and thus to be as sure as he could that Congress and the public would support his leadership of this nation-saving effort. There are at least 5 known versions of the July 4th message. These versions confirm that the president was a thoughtful pre-writer, writer, reviser, and editor. The first draft was of some 3,300 words. The second draft had 5,500 words, and the final version had 6,400 words. True to his earnest desire to capture a speech by the two senses of seeing and reading, and thus to get a feel for how his audience would react to his words, he read his still unfinished draft to several aides. No president between John Adams and Woodrow Wilson would appear personally before Congress, and so a clerk read this message of July 4th, read it to Congress on July 5th. There were 3 main points to the message, and he articulated his primary messages just after reminding Congress and the public of the commitments he had made to the Union 4 months earlier in his March 4th inaugural address and all that had happened since then. He concluded the summary of recent events by making the point that by attacking Fort Sumter, the Confederates have forced upon the country the distinct issue of disunion, of rebellion. And then he lists the significance of the war beyond just our own country. These are his words, quote, "And this issue embraces more than the fate of these United States. It presents to the whole family of man the question of whether a constitutional republic or democracy, a government of the people by the same people, can or cannot maintain its territorial integrity against its domestic foes. He really felt that if the South were allowed to secede, it would be the end of democracy, not just in this country, but worldwide. And then he says this, and what I'm going to read now is the piece of this address that's most frequently quoted, and listen carefully, please, if you will, friends. Quote, "This is essentially a people's contest. On the side of the Union, it is a struggle for maintaining in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life." For Lincoln, who was the quintessential self-made man starting with nothing, democracy is more than a mere system of political organization. It is a system of social life that gives the common man a chance. Folks, note that he's saying the leading object of the Union is to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, clear the pursuit of laudable pursuit for all. Okay, he uses the word all frequently because of the political fragility of the Union coalition and the racial prejudices across the Union of the day. He is not in a political position to take on slavery in this particular address, but he does not limit in any way in this particular paragraph those who are ultimately to be elevated by the principles of the Union. Lincoln's second key point is his condemnation of secession. Essentially, he argues that the leading secessionists in the South knew that their fellow Southerners had too much respect for the Union and its history to agree to what they thought might be a traitorous act. Because the movers for rebellion knew they could not insult the loyalty of these followers had toward the Union, they invented what Lincoln calls in this address an ingenious sophism called secession. Let's listen to what he says about that. He's talking about calling rebellion secession. He says, quote, "With rebellion thus sugar-coated, they have been drugging the public mind of their section for more than 30 years, until at length they brought many good men to a willingness to take up arms against the government when otherwise they wouldn't do that." Fellow John DeFries, who's the superintendent of public printing, looks at the term sugar-coated and says, "Mr. President, that's just not dignified. That's just not appropriate." Lincoln says, "DeFries, that word expresses precisely my idea, and I'm not going to change it. The time will never come in this country when the people won't know exactly what sugar-coated means," close quote. A third key point, ever so logically consistent with his first point, that the war is a fight for the very survival of the idea of democracy. In his second point, that secession is a sugar-coated term for revolution, is the idea that bullets must not be allowed to overrule what ballots have legitimately, lawfully, and constitutionally accomplished. And he goes on to say that a key purpose of the war is to demonstrate to the world that those who can fairly carry an election can also suppress a rebellion, that ballots are the rightful and peaceful successors of bullets, and that when ballots have fairly and constitutionally decided, there can be no successful appeal back to bullets, close quote. Over the course of the 6,400 words of this message, Lincoln spoke to many audiences and at many levels. He made clear to Seward, his critics, and his country that he was in charge. Remember Henry Raymond's New York Times editorial entitled "Wanted, a Policy"? Lincoln articulated a policy on July 4th that Congress in turn acted upon with more than 70 war messages that it would adopt in the next 28 days. There's often talk about how much Franklin Roosevelt did in the winter of 1933 on the heels of the Depression and how much he and Congress got done. I think it pales in comparison to what Lincoln got done just after this message. Lincoln could not talk about slavery. He just wasn't in a position politically to do that, and that upsets greatly abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. But the truth is that most of his supporters just weren't ready to hear that message, particularly those in the Midwest and the border states. But without a doubt, anti-slavery members of his political coalition could see some potential promise in his assertion that the leading object of the Union is to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, etc. The speech was generally well received. George Curtis, a writer for Harper's Monthly, very popular publication back then, and somebody who had been profoundly in favor of Seward as the Republican candidate for president, and very critical of Lincoln, says this. He said, Lincoln delivered a wonderfully acute, simple, sagacious, and antiquely honest speech. Curtis then said, I can forgive the jokes and the big hands and the inability to make bows. Lincoln was not particularly gracious in those contexts. Some of us who doubted Lincoln, we were wrong. Another lawyer and writer who'd been critical said this of the message: it's wholly free from egotism or desire to produce an effect, but is earnest and candid. It shows, moreover, remarkable power of thought and argument. The reflections are eminently just, and the right of secession is treated in a manner at once clear, comprehensive, and original. Through this extraordinary message, given too little attention because it was initially delivered to Congress by a clerk, Lincoln demonstrated that truly his pen was his sword. He constructed this piece in a manner true to himself, his character, his philosophy, his past, his reading of history, and his love for his country, and by doing so, went a long way toward establishing the moral authority so desperately needed to lead a country through a war truly horrific in its scope and bloodshed. Folks, every time I turn around, historians, upon credible evidence, are upping the number of war dead. When I first started as a teacher working with Benberry and Lee back in the 70s, the standard number thrown around was 623,000 dead. It's now north of 750,000. More people died in that war than every war since then. Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Iraq, Korea, Afghanistan. You aggregate all that together, it's still many fewer than the war dead lost, Southern and Northern. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, sir, for coming by and speaking today. So you were a teacher at Virginia Episcopal School. I graduated from there. My father and his brothers graduated from there. My cousins graduated from there. My great uncle graduated from there. And I just thought that there was an interesting correlation about Virginia Episcopal School and you talking about Abraham Lincoln today. I really hope that I'm right about this, because as President Lincoln said, and I quote, better to remain silent and be thought of a fool than to speak out and remove all doubt. And so with Abraham Lincoln, him and his progress with, the Emancipation Proclamation and, laying the path for racial equality moving forward, I thought that interesting because I really hope that I'm right about this, but was Virginia Episcopal School not the first private boarding school in the country to desegregate?
Lee, I think 2 schools did it that same year. I think that was 1967 through the amazing work and philanthropy of the Stouffer Foundation based in Winston-Salem. I think it was Virginia Episcopal School, another school where I spent some time, Asheville School. I think they integrated, thanks to the work of the Stouffer Foundation in 1967. There was and of course, some of you may have seen the New York Times Magazine article of a couple of years ago about the VES story. So it was very close to being the first and might well have been.
Right, and I've finished this with connecting VES with the war and President Lincoln again, just that they both said the best way to destroy an enemy is to make them my friend.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, I appreciate you coming.
Sure, thank you, Lee. Yes, sir, I see a question back there. I know you told me you gave me a little preparation on this one.
Yeah, I warned you.
Yes, you did.
The first question I would ask is, what kind of student was Lee Parker?
He was a good student, and as you might guess, knowing him like you do today, rather enthusiastic and feisty.
Yeah, that's the way he is now. Yeah. The second, seriously though, in Lincoln's second inaugural address, I'm not sure I'm quoting it exactly right, the last paragraph, malice toward none and charity for all. And it goes on in the rest of that paragraph. And kind of as a peacemaker at that particular time, the war was virtually won. It was 1865, the war was virtually won.
The question is, if he had lived, what do you think Reconstruction would have been like?
No way to know for sure. His last speech was April 11th, 1865. That's 2 days after Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox, and it's 4 days before he's assassinated. And in this April 11th speech, he's speaking from the balcony of the White House. His assassin is in the audience, and he's talking about Louisiana in particular, and he was criticized by some of the radicals in his party for being too lenient around allowing Louisiana back into the Union, his so-called 10% plan. But he also said in that same speech that if he needed to do so, he opened up the possibility, and this is one of those speeches where lots of people were critical and also lots of people saw some opportunities for hope, because he also said that he was open to the notion of giving African Americans the vote, either African Americans who had fought in the war. Remember, the number is somewhere between 180 and 200,000. After the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans fought in the war. A lot of historians believe their participation was essential to Union victory. So he suggested that he would be open to allowing African Americans to vote who had participated in the war effort, or if they had attained some level of education. And so you have to sort of then ask yourself what might have been the results of that. I think because of his character and temperament, I think it would have been a smoother Reconstruction, would have been smoother than it ended up being under Johnson. You know, Lincoln wasn't perfect. In my opinion, his biggest mistake was putting Andrew Johnson on his ticket. It's a huge mistake, huge mistake. I can understand why he did. Johnson's story was in some ways parallel to Lincoln. He was a self-made man, but he was psychologically, he was terribly insecure and terribly bigoted. Yes, sir.
On the Cooper Union speech, had Lincoln prepared copies of it in advance to give to the papers, or was it transcribed?
No, he had given those in advance, as I understand it, to the newspapers, but he would not let them release it until he could go back after he gave the speech to make sure that the transcription was accurate. And at that point, the next day it went out to 170,000 people. So they had it, but they were not given permission to release it until he had a chance to review it after the speech to make sure it was right.
I'm amazed the effect of the newspapers. I mean, without TV and the internet, and what was the literacy rate? I mean, how many people actually read
it was very high, and arguably there was much more. Well, I think it's a fact. Much more engagement with the newspaper back then than there is now. And Lincoln read numerous newspapers. He was a great student of the press, and I could give another talk on his use of the public letter that he would distribute through the press. That was again another very effective political and communication tool on his part. But you could argue that civic and political literacy might have been stronger then than it is now. It's a concern of mine as a teacher. Sandra,
Mr. Peebles, I've got one more question, please,
Yes.
from one of our Zoom participants here.
Yes.
I'm going to read it for you.
Okay.
Did President Lincoln speak on the topic of immigration and treatment of the naturalized versus the native? Declaration number 14 of the 1860 Republican Party platform discussed the full rights of immigrants.
Yeah. One of his great speeches, 1858 Chicago, as I'm recalling, where he basically said to the immigrants in the audience, and I think there were a lot of folks of Irish and German descent in his audience, he said, while you may not been born of this country, what unites us all is the Declaration. He kept coming back to this idea that what's unique about America is we're not united by tribes or ethnicity, we're united by an idea. And that was one of his really, I think, most profound points that I candidly wish we could re-embrace that today. Yeah.
What do you know of the relationship of Grant to Lincoln and Lincoln to Grant? How was that relationship, and how did that play out in policy, maybe even after his death?
They had enormous respect for one another. There was some fear that Grant might run for president in 1864. There were appropriate outreach to Grant. He said, "Not on your life, I'm a Lincoln man." And of course, right at that point, he was brought east to command all the Union forces. You know, there was the discussion about Grant and perhaps his struggle with alcohol. And, you know, there's that great quip by Lincoln that says, "Find the brand he likes and I'll send it to him," because he fights. He fights. And clearly Grant did struggle some with alcohol, but he knew when he had to stop. But there's great mutual affection and respect there. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Billy. That was really a fantastic speech and very informative. And we're happy to have you here. Come back anytime. Just one more membership welfare announcement. Randy Hartley is going to have surgery on Wednesday, so you guys check in with him, make sure everything goes okay. Hall, welcome. We're really happy to have received your application today. Lucy, Debbie, Benbury, Chris, Jason, Laura, thank you all for joining us today, and you're welcome back anytime. Next week, we have Dr. Robert Adams. I don't know what the topic is. Does anybody know the topic for Dr. Adams? Not sure about that. Speaking, and then September 30th, we have our new officer induction for next year, as well as Cynthia Curran talking about cybersecurity. October 7th, Dr. Joe Allen from Meredith College. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next week.